welcome back to a special edition of GNAT-TV's In-Depth Series. I'm Andrew McKeever, the News Director at GNAT-TV's News Project. It's a pleasure to have you with us today on Wednesday, May 22nd. It's a special edition because we are really privileged and honored to have with us today 5 of our area state representatives. Really pleased to be joined around the table today by Mike Rice, who is the state rep from Dorset, Danby, Mount Tabor, Landgrove, and Peru. Kelly Pajala is the state rep from Weston, Londonderry, Andover, and Winhall. Kathleen James and Seth Bongartz are the state reps from Manchester, Arlington, Sandgate, and Sunderland, or part of Sunderland, I should say. And Dave Durfee represents the other part of Sunderland, as well as Shaftesbury. Thank you all very much for making the time for this conversation. I guess we're going to talk a bit about the session that just ended. Well, it sort of just ended. You're all going to be headed back up to Montpelier again on June 17th for a veto override session. And so there's lots to talk about with that. But I thought we could sort of talk a little bit about this session that just ended a couple of weeks ago. It certainly seemed from the outside anyway to be a very busy session. You got a lot done, a lot of bills were worked on. And I thought we'd just go down through a few of them and kind of get your reactions and senses to how they all turned out. One of them, I know the housing and education spending bills got a lot of attention, and deservedly so, and we'll talk about those before we're finished. But I thought we might start with a few of the others that were also very important, but may not have gotten as much attention. And one of those is that Climate Superfund bill, S-259, as we, I guess, say in legislative speak. Representative Rice, I thought we could have you get us started here. Tell us a little bit about this bill, and is this likely to be one that the governor might decide to veto, or might it make it on the short list of the veto override bills that you're going to be taking up on June 17th?
Yeah, well, I don't like to be in the business of predicting which bills the governor is going to add to his record-setting list of vetoes, but he does. He has tended to veto just about every major piece of climate change legislation that comes to his desk, so that's probably a good indication. It's a really exciting bill. What it does is set up a climate super fund to start to recoup some of the resources on behalf of Vermonters, business owners, homeowners, municipalities, to deal with these major devastating climate change related storms that we're seeing. And it recoups those funds from the largest fossil fuel companies in the world, which we know have contributed in a major way to climate change and therefore to those increasingly devastating storms. It is based in really strong legal precedent. We know, from the federal Superfund legislation that's been in place for decades, to right here in Vermont, right here in Bennington County, the polluter pays model of saying, hey, you helped cause this mess, and so you should help to pay to clean it up. Because otherwise, if we don't do that, if we don't go to these, and we're not talking about small Vermont companies, we're not even talking about large Vermont companies, we're talking about the biggest fossil fuel companies in the world that had some role in the Vermont fossil fuel market over the decades in question. If we don't ask them to help pay for these, billion-dollar storms that we're seeing, that all falls on the backs of Vermonters, and we know that that's not tenable moving forward. So I can't say whether he's going to veto it. I'll say it had incredibly strong bipartisan, tripartisan, multi-partisan support in both the House and the Senate. And I'm really hopeful that we'll be able to take this step and move forward with this innovative legislation where Vermont's leading the way, but we see a lot of other states working to take the same steps.
You must have heard a lot of pushback, though, I would think, from some of those major fossil fuel companies that would be on the hook to pay for some of those damages. I mean, were there lobbyists and lawyers or whatever saying, wait a minute, you can't do this?
My recollection, it didn't come before my committee, so I only know what we talked about on the House floor and in the larger conversation. My recollection is that they were asked to testify and refused to come in and testify in person. I think they submitted some written testimony, and Seth would be able to speak to that a little bit. It went before, just to talk about its path a little bit, it went through both the Environment Committee and the Judiciary Committee. The Judiciary Committee, mostly looking at, is this constitutional? Do we have the really strong legal precedent to go ahead and do this? And they found that indeed we do.
All right, well, that'll be certainly something interesting to follow because, yeah, the price tag for flood damages and all the other climate-related issues that we've been seeing more and more frequently, that does amount to a lot of money after a while, doesn't it?
It does, and this campaign is not about like retribution, right? It's about paying your fair share. So it's about asking global fossil fuel companies who knew that they were contributing to the climate crisis to pay their fair share in helping Vermonters in our state recoup the costs and cover the damages.
I just want to add that this was not, the governor may in fact veto the bill. There was opposition to the bill in the House even. It wasn't a unanimous vote. It was tripartisan and strongly supported, and I think for very good reason. But one of the criticisms was that the multinational fossil fuel companies would just turn around and pass the cost back on to Vermonters, which clearly can't happen. That's not the way the economy works, and it wouldn't happen. We otherwise, what will happen for sure is that we Vermonters will be forced to pick up the tab for dealing with climate change and the resilience that we need to be.
Just by way of example, we have had 3 100-year floods in the last 13 years, and that's only going to get worse. And they are part of that. This is why it's happening, and it's only logical, frankly, that they should contribute to paying the cost.
So
Because
Vermont,
as somebody else mentioned, I think whichever one of you did, maybe Mike, otherwise it's going to be us alone.
and we would be the first state in the nation to have a bill like this in place, I take it. No other state has done this before.
We're the first to pass legislation, but it's definitely something that's in progress in several other states, including states, significantly larger states as well.
Interesting. Well, something sort of, I guess, related to that is the bill in the renewable energy standard, H 289. Under this bill, every utility in Vermont would eventually have to source all of its power from renewable sources by, I think, 2035. So I guess some of the pushback you might have heard was, wait a minute, this is going to increase everybody's electric bill. Was that the case, or was there pretty much a large consensus this was a good approach to take?
So this came through my committee, and a starting point for thinking about this bill or talking about it is that the utilities and the advocates came together over the last year and reached agreement. In many ways, all we did was breathe life into the framework to which they had agreed. Surprisingly, maybe for a lot of people, a number of our utilities are already 100% renewable, and so this is just bringing the rest along, and they agreed to it. They said, yes, we can do this, and then so there's the goal of getting to 100% renewable, and then there's the sub goal, if you will, of having 20% of that come from within Vermont in the form of renewable energy. And it's a goal that kind of everybody was on board for. Well, I say everybody, there's no such thing as everybody, but a large majority of people were on board for. And the costs compared to the volatility of fuel, let me back up for a second. Once we get there, we will have a stable source of power that is going to be much less expensive than in the long run than relying on fossil fuels with all the volatility that comes with that and the constantly rising prices. So it's a matter of what it's going to take to get there, but this is a carefully constructed bill that gets there slowly enough to take all of that into account. And some of the frankly hysteria about the costs is hysteria, and I think we'll see that it's far less, and that in the long run, this is one of those bills that it's very obvious that in the long run we're going to have a much more stable, lower cost sources of power than we do now.
What percentage of the state's energy use comes from renewable sources now? I mean, how big of a jump is this going to be to get us to 100%?
I can't remember the details of that question overall, but just to go back to it, a number of our utilities are already 100% renewable. And so getting there is not, and the utilities wouldn't have agreed to this if they knew they couldn't get there pretty pretty easily, or not easily. It's going to take some work, but you know, part of the reason we're 100% renewable is because we do count Hydro-Quebec toward that goal, and that has. But anyway, we've got a lot of renewable energy.
But Hydro-Quebec won't count for new.
New,
You know,
that's
new
right. New doesn't count
Hydro-Quebec
for
power
new.
wouldn't count for toward that new 100% goal. And my recollection, someone can correct me if I'm wrong, is that the new renewable energy standard moves us from 75%
Yep.
goal of 75% to 100%, and then I think crucially moves us from 10% in-state generation
20.
to 20. And what we saw with that 10% before is that it was almost treated as a ceiling. And so once we reached 10% renewable in-state generation, we stopped seeing renewable projects come online in Vermont. So upping that to 20 is going to see more generation in-state, which only means a more resilient grid for Vermont. If we're generating more of our power closer to home, that's only a good thing.
I think what has been so interesting to me, you know, Seth mentioned, you know, hysteria about the cost of the bill, and I think the last estimate I saw was that, you know, getting us to once you back out the cost of upgrading our electric grid, which has to happen anyway. The utilities are already planning on that. Velco, our transmission organization, is already planning on that. Like, the economy is moving to electric faster and faster and faster and faster. That's a global economic shift. That's a national economic shift. That's a shift that's happening already in Vermont. So the grid, our grid already needs to, you know, upgrade, get smarter. Those costs are going to be, the utilities are planning on those costs anyway. So the question is, how much, if anything, will it cost Vermonters to take this existing renewable energy standard and just try to get there a little bit faster, which is primarily what this does, while generating more in-state power. The last number I saw was that it might add a couple of bucks to somebody's electric bill way down the road. What is often overlooked in these conversations is, and how much will that save? How much will that save all of us? How much will that save the state? How much will that save, everyday Vermonters? And what I find fascinating about conversations about any climate bill is that climate change it's an environmental issue. Of course, it's an environmental issue. We see the impact that climate change has on our weather and on, when we start seeing frequent and severe storms and when we start seeing billion-dollar floods. But at its heart, the climate transition is fundamentally an economic issue as well. Our economy is shifting all around the world from fossil fuels to renewable energy. And that plays out in people's pocketbooks. And smart climate change policy, which is what we're trying to pass in the legislation and trying to have a thoughtful conversation about, is really about saying to folks, fossil fuels are hurting your pocketbook now. We need to try to shift everybody to renewable sources, which are more price stable, they are lower cost, they're going to save everybody in the long run. How do we manage that transition?
They're not volatile.
Yeah. And that's what basically almost every climate change bill is about. And it's hard to have those conversations sometimes in such a, it's hard to have those conversations sometimes.
Well, you raise an interesting point there about the electric grid. I mean, I've been reading a lot about how the grid on a national basis needs a lot of upgrading, and we're looking, if things go in the direction we'll assume, and it's going to be more of an electrical powered economy than, let's say, we have now with fossil fuels. Is the grid up to that, bearing that load, particularly when you throw in things like electric vehicles as well? And I know you also passed a bill about that and the transportation side to put some kind of a fee on electric vehicles. But when you add it all together, is there really going to need to be a lot of work on the grid to kind of?
The short answer is the grid can take it right now. The grid's
Vermont,
ready.
yep.
The grid's ready. The Vermont grid is in good shape, and these changes will be incremental And the grid upgrades will accompany the changes as they go. It's not like we have to immediately do everything, and all of it has to happen anyway. And so, but the Vermont grid is in good shape, and the Vermont grid can handle these changes. That's the short answer.
All right. Well, before we leave the environmental area, I thought we could talk about, or have you, some of you comment on this bill that I know I'm going to mangle the pronunciation of, neonicotinoid. I think neonics for short, as my understanding is.
That's what I was going
shorthand.
with.
Neonics.
Stick with the abbreviation.
Mike, I guess we'll turn to you since you're the agriculture guy here, and this bill has an impact.
A couple of
on it.
agriculture guys
Couple
at the
of
table.
agriculture.
Oh,
You got the chair
right,
here.
right, of course.
Yeah.
What am I thinking of here?
Yeah.
So, Dave, Mike, here, this one goes to you, I guess. This would ban the sale of distribution of neonics, which I guess has some application in agriculture. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I'll say a few words and I'll let Mike sort of jump in because he was the reporter of the bill and probably knows more about the issue than anybody in this room. and maybe in much larger space as well. You did pretty well. Neonicotinoid is the pronunciation, but we all just use neonics for short. And there's a class of pesticides that is demonstrably extremely toxic to bees and other pollinators. And I think that's important to note because we think of honeybees, and there's been a lot of attention paid to honeybees in particular, but there are lots of other pollinators that are wild pollinators that aren't managed the way that honeybees are. They are native rather than non-native the way that honeybees are, and there is evidence, data to show that many of the hundreds of the species that are in Vermont are threatened, but because of the use of this class of pesticides, which are used in a number of applications. They're sprayed on plants, they're sprayed on golf courses to keep them pretty, and they are used mostly to treat or coat seeds, corn seeds, and soybean seeds before they're planted. And the idea is that when they have this insecticide, when the seed has the insecticide on it, that when bugs go in and try and eat the tasty seed, that they'll be deterred from doing that because of the insecticide. The science is pretty clear, that there is a real threat to pollinators, and secondly, that in fact on the seeds, they don't really work. And I think of it as sort of the emperor's new clothes of pesticides. Unfortunately, right now, those are the only seeds that farmers are able to buy. And clearly the seed companies make more money by taking a seed, coating it with a pesticide, and then saying to farmers, here, you need this, and then eventually saying, and that's all we have available. So we're again talking about a bill that's wildly popular with Vermonters, that is supported by the science, and yet still apparently the governor doesn't think it's a good idea. And it's sad to think that he's not listening to Vermonters or listening to the science, but is listening to the multinational chemical and seed companies.
Which are the same thing.
Yeah.
The multinational chemical companies are the seed companies. They're controlled by the same parent companies. And so it's not too much of a leap to understand why the only thing available to farmers is a corn seed coated in a pesticide that doesn't work. Yeah, I mean, I would just add that I think, we sat through hours and hours of testimony on this bill, including from many Vermont farmers, as well as scientists and other experts, folks from Quebec where these seeds have been banned for 5 years. And I completely understand why farmers have fear around this, right? It's, they are dealing with so much. We talk about the storms that they're, facing, also increased pest pressure from climate change, all kinds of, in addition to just the general difficulties of of making a living as a farmer in Vermont in 2024, I understand their fear. But what we also know is that the data does not show that their fears will be borne out. The real experience over the last 5 years in Quebec does not show that their fears will be. It's the same kind of fear mongering happened there before the ban went into place. The seed industry wouldn't make the non-treated seeds available. The farmers wouldn't be able to get seeds. There would be massive crop yield differences and crop losses because they were planting these seeds without neonics applied. Those things haven't happened in Quebec. Those things haven't happened in the EU, where these seeds have been banned for years. In Ontario, where they've been banned for years. We heard from a professor at Cornell who was responsible for putting together a sort of meta study that looked at all of the field trials that have been done on this in all over the world, all over the country, all over the region. Thousands of trials that say these seeds don't protect corn growers from anything, economic or crop yield loss. So I understand the farmers' fear, and I think it's our job to listen to them and to listen to the science and to make good policy. What I don't understand is the governor sort of leading with fear instead of following data and science. That's just a failure of leadership to me, to veto a bill that just so clearly goes with the data and the science, and also is carefully constructed to protect farmers and provide for a just transition. These seeds wouldn't be banned until 2029. And that's not a random number. That's a year that was selected to be exactly in line with the bill that just passed and was signed by the governor in New York, where they grow 1 million acres of corn to our 90,000. That's to ensure that the industry will come along, will provide these seeds. It was constructed with a waiver process in place so that if a farmer is in a situation where they can present evidence that they will face economic hardship, or they can't get the seeds, or they do have a pest problem, they can apply for and receive a waiver from the Agency of Agriculture. We even improved that waiver process after we heard from farmers and heard from the Agency of Agriculture that they wanted our waiver process to look more like New York's. It didn't start out that way in the bill. It ended that way in the bill that passed the Senate by 25-2 vote and the House on a voice vote at the end. This shouldn't be a controversial bill.
Can I just add one thing about this bill? Number one, I was really impressed as the work was done in the Ag Committee about how much the Ag Committee really took into account the concerns of farmers and really adjusted for that. But the other thing is going back to the Dave raising initially that it's not just about honeybees, because the real issue is the native pollinators, as Dave was suggesting. And I just wanted to add into this discussion that we have lost whole species of native bees as a result. I think it can be tied back pretty clearly to neonics, that can't happen, because our native species are really what's so critical to the whole structure of pollination, and they're under threat. And this isn't just like a boutique bill. This is really important, and we have to stop killing our pollinators.
So this is one bill the governor already has vetoed. There are several that are still kind of waiting to see if he lets them become law without a signature. So I'm assuming this would be on the short list of bills that, because with one day, I'm thinking, how many veto overrides can you get done in one day? I mean, in 2 or 3 maybe?
Well, we surprised
No, we
ourselves
did.
last
Be on the
year.
short
How many
list?
did we do last year? 6?
Yeah.
6,
Oh,
but
really?
there's no reason why we can't stay 2 days if we need to.
Yep.
you know.
Okay. All right. Well, moving on. I guess, like I said at the start here, housing and the education funding, or the yield bill, as it's referred to, as it worked its way through the legislature, were two big things that I know I was following as closely as I could. So you ended up with a bill, H 687, which seems like a combination of reform of Act 250 and attempt to kind of incentivize more housing. I mean, Seth, I know you've been here before. You've talked about this a couple of times, I think, at this point, but I wonder if you could just remind us of what's in this bill, and does it look likely that this will get over the finish line?
Well, it's passed both bodies, and so what the bill does, so if you back up one minute, when Act 250 was passed 52 years ago, we really didn't have planning and zoning in Vermont in a meaningful way. And so Act 250 was called upon to do everything. And what's happened in the meantime is that a lot of towns have gotten to be pretty sophisticated and moved along with their planning and zoning. And Act 250 is still doing what it did 52 years ago, of kind of looking over the shoulder and making sure it's done, whatever. It's in some ways a duplicative review. And we hear when people raise that issue, they have a point. It's more complicated than that. It's not as simple, because that's partially true, partially not true, but they have a point. And so one of the things the bill does is to offer different levels for towns of having either entire sections of town not fall under the purview of Act 250, or for housing under the right circumstances when towns have met a pretty easy checklist to meet. Say that up to 50 units of housing on 10 acres can be built without Act 250 review. So that's one part of the bill. And the other part of the bill is, when I talked about it on the House floor, I talked about that portion of it, but then I talked about the theme that we've also touched on here today, about the fact that Vermont is constantly being deluged with rain, and we're having these storms and floods, and houses washing down the river. So we need to think about the issue from both ways. So one of the ways that we're looking at is, the first way is to make it easier to build housing in downtowns, and actually to go up as well. And that's really important, because you actually help, A, not have as much sprawl, and B, have vibrant downtowns. But on the other hand, we also needed to look at some of the ways that Act 250 actually isn't doing its job as well as it should or could, in terms of protecting forest blocks and headwaters and those kinds of things. So we went to another level of kind of review of those. So the bill is to, on the one hand, help deal with climate change. In some ways, it's a climate resilience bill, and in some ways, you have the natural environment and the man-made environment. We're trying to make them work in simpatico, and have both work in a way that's going to help make us resilient both socially and economically and environmentally. So, the bill's only about 200 pages, so I just touched on a little bit of it, but that's, I guess in some ways those are the building blocks. There's more about regional land use mapping, which is too detailed to get into now, but that's an important part of this. But it's really just about doing better, helping communities and regions do better planning to meet the challenges of today versus the challenges of when Act 250 came into being 52 years ago.
Representative Pajala, I'd like to bring you into the conversation on the subject, because your mountain towns district there got a lot of mountains and hills and undeveloped areas. What's your sense of how this bill is received in your district?
I think one of the challenges in my district is that the encouragement to develop our downtowns runs into a little bit of a stone wall, because most of them are right on the river, not just in the floodplain, but on the river. And in this last round of flooding and in Irene, that just wreaked havoc on the villages. So the notion of putting all of our development and dense development and wastewater in the floodplain creates a little bit of a conundrum from a longevity and vibrant community standpoint. And so my hope for this bill is that it helps towns that are in that predicament to think a little bit more out of the box about where they choose to develop. And I know that that's a really hard thing, because it means shifting geographically where your Seth used this term, center of gravity is, from an economic standpoint and from a housing standpoint. But if all we focus on is developing literally right on the river, I don't think that that is a good long-term sustainable policy direction to be going in. And I think that there are other places in state policy that are trying to actually move us away from that. So, I know it's complicated, but for small towns that maybe don't have wastewater or water and are grappling with this, like it is hard to imagine what success in those areas is going to look like, because I think that the challenges there are significantly higher than in other places.
Totally fair, and totally get it. And one of the things we did try to do, and Kelly used the term, is make it possible for towns to shift their center of gravity. And a lot of it will depend on soils, especially for the 1B towns, the so-called 1B towns, because we tried to make it low barrier for towns to get in, having sewer or water or proper soils, and provide them, working with the regional commissions, the opportunity to shift their center of gravity. But all of that is easier said. Nothing in planning is
Right.
ever easy.
It's
This is nothing, and it's easier said than done.
Right.
And Londonderry is one of those towns that, we had it in mind,
Yeah,
and
no,
we tried to
appreciate
think about that. Londonderry, I kept
Right.
Londonderry in
Right.
back of mind all the time, because I know, so I've watched for so many years what's
Right.
happened.
Right.
And but nothing's easy.
Right, but I also think it's encouraging the people who are in the positions to be doing that planning on the ground at the local level and regionally, to encourage that shift in thinking, that it is okay to pivot to moving your center of gravity. You don't have to put all of your energy into the downtown that exists, because I think that there's evidence, expensively gained evidence, that we should be thinking a little bit differently. And it's hard to get people on board when there is an emotional change that is put before people. So.
And I don't know if that brings us to just briefly touch on the river bill. We did pass a S-213, right? The river corridor bill, another one that came through Seth's committee. Seth's committee was very busy, very busy this year.
Everything controversial.
But important.
But important, yeah. And I think high level, and Seth could certainly speak to this more, but high level S-213 is a bill that also passed both the House and the Senate, and will be on the way to the governor. Or this is the time of year when we lose track a little bit, but the governor will be looking at S-213, which is a bill that really moves us toward taking a statewide look at how we manage our river corridors, instead of having one river, be managed at the permitting level by each community it flows through, to move that to the statewide level so that we can get some coherent policy in place about letting rivers run where they need to run, and also taking a look at dams, where we need them and where we don't, as I understand. So I think we've all learned, again, as Kelly said, the hard way, that in times of flood, which is going to be, Vermont's continued future challenge, rivers run where they're going to run. Mm-hmm. And that causes a lot of damage. And so we need to have thoughtful statewide permitting and management policy in place to let rivers do what they're going to do in times of severe storming and flooding.
And to give them the floodplains that they naturally need to use as that sponge, so that, because if we encroach on floodplains, it only means that our towns and villages and cities become the sponge instead of the naturally occurring floodplains.
Yep, and wetlands as well. I think the bill requires that stop me if I'm wrong, but I think if you do receive a permit to develop or destroy or damage or remove 1 acre of wetland, you would have to be required to replace that at a 2-to-1 ratio. And that's just smart. That's smart future policy. We need our wetlands to act as those sponges.
That was actually the Act 250 bill, but you had it right.
Right.
But
it got
it's
moved
all
into-
the same.
Got moved.
It's all the same.
I have to say I really appreciated this bill, and that is partially because of at the municipal level what we're experiencing with building back and trying to plan for long-term mitigation and trying to figure out where we can increase those spongy areas that are not in our villages. And, you know, 3 towns in my district and one that is in Lower Sebelia's district are really trying to look at this problem regionally. And so anything that we can do to encourage that is, I think, just going to be so helpful because, you know, towns are trying their very best to work together on this and kind of keep it moving forward, which is no small task for small municipalities. And I really hope that this change of moving that regulation to the state level is only helpful. Because I know some people find, you know, the state regulating anything to be extremely offensive, but in this case, you know, it is far bigger than what any town can grapple with on its own.
Or should have to.
Yeah, and so if towns can work together and they have the backing of their regional planning commissions, who then has the backing of state policy, I think it hopefully makes what is a very long process in the best of circumstances that much easier to at least continue to move forward on.
That's a great,
Yep.
great summary. And I just would add to that, all of this in some ways is really about, because there'll be the whole, S213 sets up a pretty long and public-driven regulation process for developing the regulations, and so that all of this is in so many ways about making it possible and giving the hand to towns and regions to do better planning. And they want to do it, as the point you were making, and they're moving in that direction. And so if we're really doing this stuff right, whether it's Act 250 or the River Corridor Bill, we're really, it's not dictating, it's really about helping to set the stage and make it easier for towns to work with the regions in the state. And all of this, because we are all in this together, this climate change and what's happening as a result to Vermont and our infrastructure is just like unbelievable, and it's only going to get worse.
And just a note on the, not to lose focus of the dam, the importance of the dam piece, because when I was out yesterday with somebody from Trout Unlimited touring through the Dorset Hollow, looking at they just completed this multi-year project to remove dams and replace culverts with contemporary bridges and crossings. All along the Meadowy from the headwaters in the hollow, basically reconnecting the Meadowy from the headwaters to Lake Champlain. And what I already knew but really got to see is that when we think of dams, we think of big municipal or state-owned dams that you see on the side of the vast majority of dams in Vermont are not that. They are on private land. They're often on private land that has changed ownership several times since the dam was installed. The dams were also often installed by private landowners, sometimes with no clear purpose, in the first half of the 20th century or earlier. And so they're not there with contemporary understanding of rivers and flooding in mind. And so if we can, with state policy, make it easier and better for private landowners to deal with these old dangerous dams that are causing a lot of problems, that's not adding regulation on the state level. That's actually adding assistance and providing. This project that happened on the Meadowy was an incredible example of it. It involved the Forest Service, State Agency of Natural Resources, Conservation District partners, Trout Unlimited as a nonprofit partner, and dozens of individual landowners all coming together and collaborating and coming to an understanding of this being necessary work and good work that was going to sort of change everybody's landscape for the better. And that's the kind of work that I think this bill and these climate resiliency bills help to move along at a quicker pace. And
interesting, this portion of our conversation started with talking about the Act 250 bill, which also at the end of the session became our big housing bill. And everything's always connected, right? And so I do just want to bring it back to housing a little bit, because that's, housing, Vermont's housing crisis is in so many ways at the heart of so many of the challenges that Vermonters are facing, and that our businesses are facing, and that our communities are facing. And the House did pass this year a big housing bill, H.829, and that bill ultimately didn't make it across the finish line. That was one of those big picture bills that are often really useful in kind of advancing a conversation, which a lot of times the legislature it's a conversation, right? Like, we put forward a bill, advocates support this part, communities come out and say, what about this? It becomes this kind of iterative back and forth process. And H29, I think, is a good example of that. The House passed a bill that contained basically a 10-year plan, a 10-year vision to really turn the corner on Vermont's the challenges that Vermont is facing with homelessness, and the challenges that Vermont is facing with affordable housing. H.829 was a 10-year vision to really, not solve, but I would say make significant progress on that challenge. It also contained, often controversially, a plan to pay for that, because that kind of money does not exist right now in our current state budget. And we would have paid for that work in part by creating a new income tax bracket for Vermonters who have a household income of $500,000 or more. That part of the bill hit the rocks, basically. It's probably a conversation that we can continue to have. But the bill also contained a lot of just nuts and bolts housing policy that did get moved into the Act 250 bill. So that includes very popular and I think impactful programs like VHIP, the Vermont Housing Improvement Project. Yeah, VHIP. VHIP has proved incredibly effective at creating affordable housing units all over the state, across Bennington County as well. That provides housing developers from small to large with money for creating housing units that are available to low income and moderate income Vermonters that are, think of like maybe a blighted building, right? Or a 4-unit home or building where it's not up to code, and somebody can take that grant money or that forgivable loan money and use it to put four units on the market that weren't there before. That's in the Act 250 bill, a program that we have in place for middle income housing that helps developers close the gap between what it costs right now to develop units that are affordable to more moderate income Vermonters, when a developer can't afford to put that. The cost of building and labor is so high right now that developers can't afford to develop homes that are affordable to middle income Vermonters. So a lot of that policy is in the Act 250 bill, and I hope we're able to get it across the finish line. It's an important bill.
All right. Well, we could talk about housing, I think, for
We
now,
could.
all by itself. There's so many fascinating aspects to that. But we'll move on here. Because the other thing I wanted to ask you all about was the so-called yield bill, the bill that you put together to help fund public education in the state. Most property, I guess the big number is 14% or 13.8%, I guess is the exact average of what folks will see their property taxes rise to pay for school budgets around the state. Now that's a bit lower than what we were hearing initially, but I think 20% was the number that was being bandied about. So I guess I just wondered, do you feel like nobody likes to see their tax rate go up by 14%, but was that sort of the best solution that was available at this point in time? And I know another part of this bill, I believe, is a formation of a study committee to look at longer range solutions to how we're going to finance education in the state. But did you all feel like it wound up in a decent place?
I'm happy to kick off that conversation. We all did, but I spent a significant amount of time this year thinking about and writing about education, funding and the future of our public schools and the future of our independent schools. And I think that at the very foundation of this conversation is something that there are two interconnected things that I think are really important for Vermonters to understand, which is that when we talk about affordability and the huge struggles that so many families and Vermonters are having right now with affordability, a lot of that comes down to property taxes. There is inflation, which is pushing the price of everything through the roof. That is not something that the Vermont legislature has any ability to control. Inflation and just the general cost of living. But one thing where every Vermonter and every school board and the legislature all have a really important role to play is in property taxes. And when you talk to Vermonters about taxes and the cost of living, if you talk to them and really try to get to the bottom of it, property taxes, I think, have been at the very center of that conversation this year. I don't think I'm wrong in that. And I think what folks need to understand is that property taxes are a direct result of school spending. So it works in a little bit of an opposite way of what people sometimes think, which is that the legislature doesn't convene in Montpelier and sit around talking in a vacuum about how we're going to set property tax rates. That is not how it works. The legislature is required to set property tax rates at a level necessary to fund the school budgets that voters all over Vermont debate and pass every year. So school boards work, I think, incredibly hard to develop responsible, thoughtful school budgets that meet the needs of their schools, that meet the needs of our students, that try to manage costs against pressures that are often beyond their control. Healthcare premiums for all of our hardworking educators were up 16% this year. School boards don't manage and control that. That's negotiated at the statewide level. Federal pandemic funds that school boards that flowed directly to districts were ending this year. Oftentimes, school boards were using those monies to pay for programs that are incredibly important to their students, and the need for those programs haven't gone away. So they're looking at, should we roll the costs of those ongoing expenses into our budget? That falls to taxpayers. Inflation, through the roof for everything. School boards can't control that. So they're bringing these budgets to voters. Voters are, in our case, passing those budgets by wide margins. I'm glad about that. I want to make sure we're supporting our schools. And all over the state, the costs of those budgets get totaled up. The education fund carries other expenses sort of on the top of it that get added on to the top. And then the legislature is required to set property tax rates at a level that returns those dollars to districts that their voters have approved. So we started out this year looking at, as school boards were starting to develop their budgets, it was looking like a terrifying average, percent increase of 20% or higher. As budgets started to be approved, and we started seeing the real costs, we made some changes in the legislature that helped to bring those costs down, the overall cost of the ed fund down. Lower budgets were passing, some budgets were getting rejected, and then in the end, the legislature wound up taking some steps to provide property tax relief, like applying some reserve funds, a one-time transfer. You can debate the wisdom of this, but a one-time transfer from the general fund of $25 million that will bring down property tax rates for this year, and a few other short-term cost containment measures. But so basically, the legislature worked over the course of the year to try to bring down the impact of property taxes on Vermonters to cover the cost of voter-approved budgets.
It's worth just noting quickly that in some ways, when we voted on this, the choice was get it down to the 13.8, or if you voted no, that meant 18. So I think we all went with 13.8 because we did what we could to get it
But
done.
what would have happened if a lot of communities, I mean, I think roughly 1/3 communities around the state said no to their proposed school budgets? I mean, what would happen if they just kept on saying no? I mean, because a couple of towns, I believe, have voted twice to reject their proposed budgets, even when the school boards have whittled away a little bit and gotten the cost down, but it's still just too high, and the voters there are just saying, no, too much.
That happens. That's not, and wouldn't be unique to this year. It's happened in the past, and ultimately, you continue to present a budget to voters, and they ultimately will pass a budget. It may take months, but
In the
ultimately
meantime,
it's-
you can
Borrow.
up to 87% of
Yep.
your the previous year's budget.
Right now, that's the default. You know, if a budget is not, if voters keep rejecting budgets, and again, I'm very glad that that has not been our situation.
Right, that has been the case.
Yeah, but if voters keep rejecting budgets, that school board does have authority to borrow, which is not great, up to 87% of the current year budget until they get a budget in place. They have to pay that money back with interest. You know, the Scott administration came forward kind of at the final hour with a proposal for the yield bill that it essentially would have, I think it was a poorly considered idea. It essentially would have, you know, provided short-term property relief this year by borrowing money to help out folks this year. That is not a long-term solution. And I was very glad to see that Governor Pichek came forward almost immediately and said that plan would have been.
Yet, I don't
Yeah,
think.
sorry, I was in a different mode. Treasurer Pichek came forward almost immediately with very strong testimony saying that that would be very damaging to Vermont's credit rating and to our ability to bond, and nobody needs that. So, you know, short-term measures to provide property tax relief feel good now. And the legislature, I think, in the yield bill did some of those things in a way that still is within the bounds of being responsible. But what we did in the yield bill, and I'm excited about this work. I think it's important. You know, as we were considering this year other short-term measures to rein in school spending, basically, or to try to do cost containment, we heard very, very, very strongly from our local school leaders that hasty, ill-considered, poorly vetted measures to just slam down school spending this year could have very dangerous unintended consequences that we're all going to regret in the long run. I don't think that's the way to make good policy. So another thing that the yield bill includes, which I think is really important, is a task force that would be required to come to the legislature in December, this coming December, with more thoughtful cost containment measures for the legislature to take up in 2025. And then a long-term vision for how we not only fund but deliver education in Vermont that the legislature would look at in 2026. And those are going to be hard conversations. That's looking at everything from school consolidation to class size to our town tuition program to staffing levels. And that task force, again, if we get this bill across the finish line, will be required to take testimony in a very public way from a huge swath of Vermont's education community and also hold public hearings in every county, which I think is important.
Also, just along the lines of short term versus long term, I think it was disappointing to see after they came at the very end, you know, after the administration came at the very end with the ill-conceived proposal to, you know, essentially put our school funding on a credit card, that the treasurer indicated would have serious negative impacts for the state's credit rating. there were no other ideas. And since then, it's just been expressing disappointment with the legislature for not taking up structural change in the yield bill. I just think that that is so irresponsible. You don't make structural change on the fly. You don't make structural change without input from stakeholders and from Vermonters who are impacted by the structural change you might be proposing. You don't do that in a couple of months. So I think that the yield bill that passed the legislature takes the responsible course of getting tax rates as low as possible for this year and setting up a commission that will bring us toward the structural long-term change that everybody agrees is necessary. I think also the other thing, just to when we talk about that 13.8% average, it's important to remember that,
Yes.
first of all, it's an average. It's, the best, easiest number we can point to on a statewide level, but it's not incredibly relevant on a town by town level. And the vast majority of Vermonters pay their property taxes based on their income, not based solely on the value of their property. So there is a sensitivity built in to make sure that the Vermonters who can least afford a significant property tax increase will be most protected from that.
And we were successful also. Things changed so much at the last minute. But one thing that the House fought for that I believe remains in the yield bill is a mechanism to provide the 2/3 of Vermonters who pay based on their income. That's 2/3 of Vermonters paying based on their income with a bigger credit this year to help soften that blow. And yes, that made it across the finish line. And that's going to be important because, that income-based credit is a big deal for 2/3 of folks.
This is such a fascinating subject. I found myself thinking, gosh, we could talk for another half an hour about this, but we have a few minutes left. And before we have to run, I thought one other bill that you guys worked on this year, H72, a harm reduction bill, is one we could quickly talk about. This is a bill that would allocate some funding to pilot an overdose prevention center in Burlington, and would also, I guess, involve organizing another study by the Vermont Department of Health looking at the impacts of the program on overdoses around the state. I guess the good news we've heard recently is that overdose deaths in Vermont declined slightly in 2023 compared to the year before. So that's good news, although it's starting from a rather high level, so
Right.
a lot of progress yet to come. I guess I just wondered, Kelly, let me turn to you, if I may. Do you think this was a good bill, and is this I guess the governor's objection is that the money should have gone to treatment in other ways?
Well, I do actually think it's a good bill. It came out of my committee, and we spent a lot of time last year taking testimony on overdose prevention centers, and again this year spent a fair amount of time on it. And for starters, Burlington is asking for the ability to do this. So it is not something that the legislature is forcing on a community. It is a community who is, as much as they can be, ready, willing, and able to try to provide this. So it actually felt good to be doing something that a community wants.
Forcing it down their
Right,
throats.
instead of forcing it on anyone. And while there are a lot of other things that are a part of treatment and recovery for anyone who's dealing with an addiction or a substance use problem, I actually think that the overdose prevention centers are a form of harm reduction and are a part of getting people into treatment and getting people connected to resources that can help them, whether they're ready for that today or tomorrow or months from now. If you overdose and you die, you don't have the opportunity to make changes in your life. And so if what we're doing is being able to keep people alive and provide them with resources that when they are ready they can turn to, I think that is a form of treatment, or at least a help to get people there. And although we are seeing that this year there was a decrease in overdose deaths, that is not a trend, and I don't think that we should celebrate any number. And I think it's a good use of funds. I think it has been proven to be helpful in other communities, in other countries, and in what little evidence we have from in this country. And so while it is controversial, I think it's worth a chance. And if there's a community that wants to support doing it, I think we need to give it a shot.
I wonder if you all think that an overdose prevention center like that would be welcome down here in Benneton County somewhere, or in Wyndham. Is that something people are ready for?
So when the bill started out, it actually had 2 potential pilot sites in it, and it changed to just one, partially from a funding standpoint, and just the process of it going through the House and the Senate. But originally there was a thought that there would be a second one in another location in the state, and that was being looked at in southern Vermont. And
It's kind of sort of hypothetical too, because I think the bill, as it made it across the finish line, required municipal support.
Yes,
So
it did require municipal buy-in, absolutely.
as Kelly said, this bill is it's a pilot in Burlington because Burlington wants to pilot this, and then we'll gather data and see whether it would, whether it merits further state funding or state support. But I can't see a world, honestly, in which this would ever move forward in Vermont, in a community where folks hadn't voted to give it a try. It's requiring municipal support is key to this, because if a community doesn't want it,
Yeah, then it won't be
it's not going to work.
successful.
Yeah.
And that was actually a bit that was added in my committee,
Yeah.
because that was something that was, people felt strongly about that.
I find myself wondering about how it all works. I mean, because the idea is, I guess, you don't want someone shooting up heroin or fentanyl or whatever alone. And the idea would be someone comes into a space, if they're not by themselves, there's someone there to, just in case things go horribly wrong and they need immediate help, and Narcan or whatever, there's someone there to help them, either get them to the hospital or do whatever. I just, I find myself wondering how, in other places where this has been tried, have there been a lot of folks who are struggling with addiction who say, okay, I really feel the urge and the craving to, inject something. I know it's a bad idea. Let me get to this harm reduction center and there's someone there. Are there really a lot of people who do that rather than just say, hey, I just want to do it, I'll take my chances?
I would say yes, there are. And it's not just about having a space where someone can go use drugs. It is also about having a space where someone can feel like they're going to walk in a door and not be judged, and get to know people and form connections. And it is not just like you're given a chair and you can sit in it and get high. There's also the potential for wound treatment. There is also a way to get people resources and get people connected with social services. It is not just one thing happening in a building. It is creating a place where community can be formed, and if the vast majority of overdose deaths are happening with people who are using alone, you're creating a space where people aren't going to be alone. And by doing that, it's a place that people will go back to. And I think that's where the, long-term positive effects come from, is that you're creating an open door that people feel comfortable walking through.
And no stigma.
Yeah.
All right.
The stigma is key. I have to say, the debate on the House floor about this bill was really distressing at times, because some of the opposition had a real those people undertone to it. And, those people who are struggling with addiction in our communities are us.
Right.
They are our kids, they are our families, they are our neighbors. That was the part of that debate that I found to be the most disturbing, honestly. And so, we are never going to turn the corner on substance use disorder in our communities until we continue to combat the stigma that is still, depressingly enough, associated with this.
Mr. Durfee, I didn't get around to asking you about the PFAs. Do you want to deal with that in 30 seconds or less?
Well, I think it was
It
probably.
was in my committee,
that
but
was gonna be-
and it's a bigger,
we
it's
passed.
a longer
Yeah,
conversation
it,
than.
it,
That's
it
another
does
way to
more
talk
than
about it for
30
another
seconds,
hour.
but yeah, we passed legislation that would further limit the use of PFAS, that class of
It was,
plastics.
There was that was the situation that arose in Bennington 5 or 6 years ago. I
Yeah,
guess,
even
at
longer
this
now.
point.
Yeah.
Around ChemFab and the other. So we worked on that. That's we'll have to have you come back, or the two of you come back and talk about that in far more
Be
depth
happy to
than
do
that.
that.
But
Yes.
that was an important bill for sure.
Yes.
So many important bills. Probably I have a list of about 10 or 12 more that we could have talked about, but
Yeah, prior authorizations, data privacy, we'll have to come back.
Okay, well, we can do this again. But for now, I just want to thank you all again very much for making the time to be here. A really thoughtful, interesting conversation. So really grateful to have Representative Mike Rice, Representative Kelly Pajala, Representative Kathleen James, Representative Seth Bongartz, and Representative Dave Durfee with us to walk us through what the legislature has been doing this past 5 months or so. It was a long session, very active, and I guess we're not done yet. So one more chapter yet to come. Anyway, I want to thank you folks for being with us today. Hope you found the show interesting, and well, maybe we'll see you again another time. All right, meanwhile, take care. Thank you very much.
Thank you.